Leung Chun-Ying, or CY as he is better known, served only one term as Hong Kong's chief executive between 2012 and 2017. A self-made man and surveyor by profession, he struggled with popularity as the city's leader during a troubled tenure that saw the beginning of localism, civil unrest, and independence advocacy in Hong Kong.
The Hong Kong SAR government is resolute in opposing the unlawful occupation actions by Occupy Central.
He was no longer in charge during the anti-government protests and street violence of 2019. But since then, as an elder statesman backed by Beijing, he has been extremely vocal, visible and influential in the sweeping legal and political changes that have brought the city to heel. The biggest question now is whether he will run for chief executive again, and what that would mean for Hong Kong. In this episode of Talking Post, CY Leung sits down with us to discuss his intentions, motivation, advice, and more.
Are you going to run for chief executive? So CY Leung, thank you very much for joining the show. The situation we are in Hong Kong right now, we had actually done a pretty good job. We had the disease and the containment under control. And now all of a sudden we have this Omicron outbreak and everything's shut down again. People are suffering, businesses. Where did we go wrong? Was this unavoidable? Because Omicron was all around the world anyway.
It's good, but not good enough for the purposes of central government and the local government of the mainland.
Now, when you say not good enough, you mean our efforts here in Hong Kong?
The results.
The results?
Yeah.
What about our pandemic strategy, the way we're going about it? What do you think about that? Are we doing it the right way?
You know the mainland has adopted a zero COVID strategy. They also have these measures to test everyone whenever there's an outbreak, and in some cases a single case. So they are very, very strict. So they're basically saying that if you want to be part of this Chinese bubble, then you have to accomplish the same results.
Well, we are taking very strong measures, right? We have something that's described as a brutal quarantine regime, very strict in terms of banning flights, etc. So considering that we're doing all that, what more could we possibly do?
Mandatory testing.
Community-wide, you mean? Like everyone?
Mandatory vaccination for workers and people in certain sectors such as healthcare, elderly care homes, education, etc. And these are not, if we do this in Hong Kong, we would not be the only place in the world to do this. You know, certain parts of the United States, certain parts of Canada, certain parts of Europe have already mandated this.
You're talking about testing, right? You're not talking about mandatory vaccination.
As well. For certain sectors of the community.
But not population-wide, because that would be forcing a lot of people who don't want to.
You can't do it absolutely population-wide when you have elderly people sort of who are immobile and people who are medically exempt from vaccination. You can't do 100% vaccination.
So if we were to do mandatory testing and vaccination for focus groups, etc., you think we can pull out of this?
At least we would improve the way that we're being seen by the mainland and central authorities. And it would also improve their confidence in us containing the issue.
And that's all because of the all-important reopening of the border, which Hong Kong needs to do, right?
Is it more important to reopen the boundary between Hong Kong and the rest of the country, China? Or is it more important to reopen the border between Hong Kong and other countries? If we had to choose, and it appears that we have to make a choice, I would say that just look at the number of Hong Kong people who live on a permanent basis on the mainland. We are talking about 370,000 people. As well, the mainland is Hong Kong's biggest economic and trade partner. It is the biggest destination of Hong Kong investment overseas. Hong Kong is also the biggest recipient of mainland investments. So if you look at all these angles, it's not just talk about sort of business interests. You're talking about Hong Kong young people having to visit their elderly parents who have retired in Fujian province or Guangdong province, and vice versa. You're talking about mainland university students or Hong Kong students coming back to visit their families in Hong Kong. You're talking about a huge number.
All right, let's move on to another issue that you like to talk about quite a bit, which is housing. You've been quite vocal about it. You've spoken a lot about it, even to the extent that sometimes you've gone up against the current administration in terms of your ideas. You also spoke about public housing, public rental housing, and how you don't seem to favor going all out with public rental housing, more about subsidized housing and home ownership, that people actually own homes. Now, you've already taken a crack at it as CE during your tenure. What has changed now in terms of the situation, in terms of a more compliant legislative council as well, that you could do a better job now? So how do we go about it? Because this is a perennial, this is a constant, it's like a plague in Hong Kong, this unaffordable housing. How do we solve this once and for all?
Firstly, there's a very, very strong aspiration for home ownership in Hong Kong. As in the case of Chinese communities in other parts of the world, I mean, you go to Western countries, go to America, you look at Chinese home ownership rates is probably the highest amongst the population in the country. Secondly, what I've been doing in the last 4 years was basically repeating what I proposed when I was Chief Executive between 2012 and 2017. There was, yes, a gap between what I proposed and what I was able to achieve because I couldn't get through the filibusters in the Legislative Council. My government in those 5 years was accused of grabbing land blindly. In local Cantonese is 盲搶地, so blindly grabbing land. Why? Because we used and we took on every opportunity to create more supply. On the demand side, quite early on during my 5-year term, I managed down and then managed out demands that were not local, that were not home ownership for home ownership purposes. For example, speculative demand, investment demand, and also demand from people outside of Hong Kong, mainly from the mainland, by using pretty aggressive stamp duty rates to discourage such demand. Actually, in my last policy address in 2017, I actually proposed that we asked the Housing Society, which is a non-profit making housing body in Hong Kong, to engage consultants to study the possibilities of using parts of the fringe areas of country parks for public housing, and also, which is something that people have forgotten about, for decent elderly housing.
But which Chief Executive Carrie Lam keeps saying, no, that's not the way.
You have to ask her. Sorry, I can't answer the question for her. But as I said, we pulled out all the stops to increase supply, and we managed to sort of manage out non-Hong Kong-based, non-occupational demand.
These are ideas that make sense, but in terms of practicality, because right now you're not the Chief Executive and you're making all these proposals, is it a different scenario altogether when you actually get into the government and you realize that it's not so easy?
The scenario has been very different since the filibustering legislators got out of LegCo. Now we have a legislative council that is more reasonable, that's more rational, but I could still anticipate certain opposition from them, and you get different ideas from different parts of the legislature. But at least I think we will be able to win over the majority of legislators to get to the nitty-gritty of the process of land conversion, converting a piece of land from non-residential use to residential use.
Let's talk about the changes that Hong Kong has gone through, for example, with the legislature. So what has happened is, after the 2019 protests, the Hong Kong government, and with Beijing, at Beijing's behest, is taking steps to fix all the problems that emerged in 2019. So one is the reform of the legislature. The district councils have been purged of anti-China or anti-government forces, people who were there just for the sake of opposition as opposed to doing community work. So these are all the changes that are going on. There's education reform going on. Now we're talking about reform of the media as well because of the way perhaps some media outlets behaved in 2019. But there is a question here, which is, the reforms, the changes that are being undertaken, the justification is understandable given our past history, but where does it all end? I mean, we're talking about one country, two systems, and I do accept that there has been too much focus on two systems and not one country. But now, aren't we in a real danger of too much focus on one country at the cost of two systems?
Well, we're now 25 years into the establishment of the SAR, and we're 25 years into the implementation of Basic Law. One country, two systems is no longer a forward concept. It's actually detailed in the 160 articles in the Basic Law. Now, let me give you maybe just one example. It's a very clear, a very simple example. When we talk about democracy in Hong Kong, and we talk about one man, one vote, electing the chief executive. Before the election of the chief executive by one man, one vote, it's a clear provision in the Basic Law that says that the candidates are nominated by the nomination committee. Now, what happened in 2014 and what happened in 2019? And people wanted what they call genuine universal suffrage. Now, if you want to be genuine, you have to follow the Basic Law. And the Basic Law doesn't allow civic nomination, meaning everyone in the community could nominate someone else as a chief executive. You need a nomination committee nomination. Now, so when you talk about one country, two systems, I mean, whether Hong Kong is going to be like another Chinese city practicing the mainland system, it's oversimplifying the situation. I mean, you really have to follow the Basic Law. And this is what I think people in Hong Kong should understand. And to this very day, I still have to sort of go out and give talks about what's actually in the Basic Law. So what I would say to the people in Hong Kong and the international community is that please spend a couple of hours on a Saturday afternoon with a cup of tea in your hand and read, please, Article 1 to Article 160.
They're not going to do that.
Well, I'll plead again, please. Otherwise, please don't talk about Hong Kong losing its two systems.
One country, two systems. A prominent feature of that is also our free media, free press. With the closure of Apple Daily, Stand News, etc., the rest of us are now very worried about where is the red line? Where is the bottom line? Which lines can we cross or not cross? And we are heading into a very uncertain territory here, and even a slippery slope as such. I mean, at the rate we're going, is it going to be a stage where we can no longer criticize you?
I don't think so. I just read...
Where does it end? Where do you stop? Because some of it is very nebulous, the allegations being made against some of these companies.
The national security law is a piece of new law in Hong Kong. And if you look at other parts of the laws, which people might say impinge on the freedom of expression, the freedom of the press, for example, libel law, you cannot be 100% certain as to what constitutes libel and what doesn't. And if you read decided cases in Hong Kong under common law, which covers libel, in the past 20 years, we have precedents, well established, long-standing precedents overturned by, for example, the Court of Final Appeal. So I don't think it's reasonable to expect anyone, government included, to come and say, these are red lines, and so long as you don't cross a red line, that you do not commit a criminal offense under the national security ordinance or law. In the same way that no one could be reasonably expected to tell you where's a red line in the law against libel.
But they're talking about introducing a fake news law, for example. Would you support something like that, the fake news law?
Well, like many of these discussions in Hong Kong, I mean, you have 2 or 3 words, and then you ask people whether to support this. And obviously, it's up to people who think there might be a fake law or legislation in Hong Kong, or people propose such legislation in Hong Kong, to actually come up with this contents. Before the contents actually out, I'm not going to comment on them.
So then let's keep talking about one country, two systems, because the whole discussion about press freedom was one aspect of one country, two systems. Where is one country, two systems now in Hong Kong? And is there a real future with this whole system? Or in the true spirit of what was originally granted to Hong Kong? One country, two systems.
People will think that we are not practicing one country, two systems in Hong Kong, would have to come up with cases or examples and reasons which of the 160 articles of the Basic Law is not being practiced. Now, when, for example, people say that we are losing our democracy in Hong Kong, now read the Basic Law, point to any of the articles of the Basic Law and say, you promised us this and you're not following this. Now, on the question of democracy, which is to a lot of people the overriding issue in Hong Kong, the Basic Law did not promise civil nomination. The Basic Law did not promise electing a chief executive in Hong Kong without having to be appointed by the central people's government. It's all in black and white in the Basic Law. So you can't cast the Basic Law aside and say you're not giving us the freedom of this and freedom of that. You're not giving us democracy in Hong Kong. You're not giving us autonomy in Hong Kong. So please show us the Basic Law.
You do realize, though, that there is a vast swathe of this population sitting at home. They're not out in the streets protesting, but they're sitting at home and they're resentful. And they show that their opposition, their resentment, their unhappiness manifests in many different ways. Right? And you see explosions of that suddenly with nastiness, like when a policeman gets stabbed, people celebrate it, that kind of stuff. So this is a reality. Have we reached now Hong Kong's reached a stage now where, you're no longer the prodigal son, you're coming back into the fold, so to speak, after the protests of 2019. But it's all not fine and dandy, right? I mean, this from now on, all the talk we hear from government officials, from mainland officials is, now you guys are on the right track, now it's all the way to prosperity. But are we leaving behind, are we ignoring, saying that's up to you what you want to do with this vast swathe of the population which is not convinced and which is still very unhappy?
I'm fully aware of the resentment that I just mentioned. I'm fully aware of the scale of it as well. I have a lot of sympathy for such people because I think the majority of them have been misled.
These are not necessarily the stone throwers, right? I mean, we're talking about people who...
In 2014,
yes.
In 2014, when the Occupy Central movement was largely and relatively peaceful compared to what happened in 2019, a lot of young students sitting out there in Harcourt did not read the Basic Law. They were not aware of the fact that the Basic Law doesn't provide for civic nomination. And that's what they wanted, very explicitly and very clearly. They've been misled. And again, one country, two systems is no longer a vague concept. It's law. And no one should breach the Basic Law.
Are the protests coming back, do you think?
We can't be complacent. We can't be complacent. As I said, I'm fully aware of the fact that there is a good measure of resentment out there. And there's a lot of work to be done.
Now, we've been talking a lot about a lot of issues, everything, but we've been circling around the elephant in the room, which is very simply this. What are you up to when you talk so vocally about need for improvement, etc., in the way Hong Kong is being run and the Western perception of Hong Kong, etc.? You're very vocal about all this. Is this all about you want to take another shot?
Trying to find a solution for Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been trapped as a member.
But we have a government in place.
As a member of the local community.
As a member of the local community,
yes.
Strictly yes. As CY Leung, private citizen,
yes,
saying, why don't you do this?
I know something about the Basic Law. Yes. I know something about the all-important relations between Hong Kong and the central authorities and the mainland provinces, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, you're an elder statesman.
I believe that I have something to contribute.
Are you going to run for chief executive?
Well, I'm not going to re-answer that question. I've answered it many times in the past 60
No, but see, I mean, okay, I understand saying you cannot say, I want to run for chief executive, etc. I understand that. Let me ask it in this way, which means this is the reality in Hong Kong right now. We have Carrie Lam as the chief executive. Right? She's finished her first term. The CE election is coming very soon. This is unprecedented that we have no idea who's running, who's not running, who's going to continue. Right? Everyone is in suspense. Time is running out. This is unprecedented. So, and you are very vocal, you're very active. Now you tell me that you're saying it as a private citizen, which I accept at face value. But is there more to it than this? Okay, let me ask you this. Do you think there is a need? Do you think you feel the need to step in now and say these things and call for reform and show people the way to go about it?
I think we should ask ourselves this question, which is much more important than guessing who's going to run, who will be the chief executive leading Hong Kong in the next 5 years. And the question that we should ask is, what kind of chief executive do we need? And the question before this is, what kind of situation Hong Kong finds itself in the next 5 years? I believe firmly running up and down the country. And I spent in 2021 a third of my time on the mainland. Seeing the progress, the speed and extent of the progress, I firmly believe that we have the next 5 years as the last window for Hong Kong. Now, let's be aware of that.
Why last window?
The last window of opportunities.
Why? Why is that the next 5 years is the last window? I mean, what's the deadline there?
The role of Hong Kong in the development of the country, which is fast reforming itself and fast developing, has become very competitive on the world stage. And the purpose that Hong Kong could serve in the overall national development is something that we should be mindful of. Who would be able to lead Hong Kong? And this who is a plural, not a singular, meaning not just the chief executive himself or herself, but the entire government team. Who do we need? So it's not a question of going to the Happy Valley race course and putting your money on a horse. It affects the entire society, 7.5 million of us. And so I think we need to talk about the sort of leadership first. And then we'll talk about, before that, the situation we find ourselves in, will find ourselves in the next 5 years. And then we ask ourselves fairly, what kind of chief executive do we want?
Have you thought of yourself as a candidate also for the convener of the new election committee, which is a more of an elder statesman's role? Have you ever considered that?
No.
Not at all?
No.
But you thought about the CE role at least?
No.
At all?
No.
You've dodged my questions beautifully, like a real professional dancer here. But do I come out at the end of this interview to tell people CY Leung is not running for CE?
I'm not going to repeat my answer.
Okay, I guess we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.